All right, everyone. Briefly, I want to talk about the tragedy of the commons. So this is related to externalities, but it is its own separate concept. So we sometimes refer to it as the commons problem or the tragedy of the commons. And so I point to Billy Joel. If you know that song, Downeaster Alexa, and in that song, he sings about the plight of fishermen on Long Island who drive their boats. In the singer-songwriter's perspective, his Alexa, that's the name of his boat, more and more miles from shore every year, right? And they're trying to catch fish, and they're having more trouble. So it's really an issue about overfishing. The commercial fishermen have overfished the waters close to shore, and so they have to go farther and farther out in an effort to make their livelihood, to sustain themselves and their families by catching fish. And so it's really a problem of overuse, right? In this case, overfishing. Right, so overfishing is one example of an overuse problem of a common resource. And so the fish in open waters are what we would call a common resource, hence the tragedy of the commons, right? It's a common resource problem. No one owns the fish when they're out there swimming in open waters. You only have a right to them when you catch them, right? So you go out there with your nets, you catch the fish. Now the fish become yours. It's very philosophical in a sense, right? If you've studied John Locke, right, and his idea that in a Lockean state of nature, no one owns anything, and you claim things by mixing your labor with that common resource. It's very much if you've taken a philosophy class and you've thought about that, it seems relevant here, right? The common resource is not owned by anyone, and so you catch the fish, bring them in, take them to the dock, to the fish market, and you sell them, right? At some point when you catch them, they're yours, and you sell them. And so everybody, all the commercial fishermen, want the fish. But what's the problem with overfishing versus sort of sustainable fishing, right? Sustainable fishing would be we harvest a certain amount of fish and we leave certain fish behind, and they will repopulate. And and then the next season, later that season, the next season, the next year, there will still be a vibrant fish population of which we can catch a sustainable harvest, and then leave some behind. And I suppose if you had a private fish farm, if you were raising freshwater fish in a lake or pond or, a body of water that you own and control, it's probably what you would do because you generate revenue, right? You get value from catching the fish, but also you generate revenue and value from the fish you leave behind so that you can harvest more fish next year and the year after that and the year after that. You're managing an income stream, from this resource, both in the present and in the foreseeable future, in the long-term future. The problem with fish in the open waters is if I'm out there fishing and I'm like, all right, I think that's enough for today, we better leave some behind, some other fisherman schmuck is going to pull up and catch the fish that I leave behind, right? I leave them behind and Billy Joel comes up with his Alexa and catches the remainder of the fish. So if I know this, and there's a little game theory here, right? If I know he's going to catch all the fish and not leave enough behind, I might as well take as many as I can harvest today too. And so no one has the incentive to maintain. There's no long-term incentives to take care of things. So overfishing in open waters is a good example. There are historical examples with grazing. If you put animals out in a pasture, a pasture can sustainably carry a certain number of animals. If you put too many into it, they'll eat all of the vegetation down to the bare ground. They'll trample it with their hooves or their feet. They'll ruin the vegetative matter on the field itself. Right? They'll destroy the pasture by overgrazing. So a good farmer, will manage the amount of livestock he keeps in a pasture, both to fatten up cattle, and livestock now, but to also preserve the value of the pasture and the carrying capacity of the pasture for the future. And perhaps a little closer to home, if any of you have ever shared an apartment with other young people, then, and if you haven't, you've probably seen it on TV or heard about it. What happens to the common areas like the kitchen or a shared bathroom or the living, area? Sometimes it can get very, very messy, right? And somebody somebody some Saturday says, all right, we're going to clean this kitchen. They work really hard and they clean the sink out and clean all the dishes and get it back together. And unfortunately, you do that Saturday morning, unless your roommates are also on board, sometimes by Sunday night, it's a disaster again. That's an example of a commons problem, right? Where nobody owns the common resource. So one potential solution is that of property rights. If you can assign property rights so that somebody owns the resource, then they will manage it both in the near term and the long term. In some cases, that works better than others. In the case of the common pasture, you could fence it into sections. So the classic example is where a village, a historical, medieval village, let's say, has a common pasture, and people own the animals, the livestock, but they all put them out there together, and collectively they overgraze it. Well, what if you took the big common pasture and fenced it into smaller units and gave each family like their own section, their own unit? Then they would probably maximize the value of that pasture both in the short term and the longer term. That might work with fencing the pasture. It doesn't work as well in open waters. And so we might need other kinds of regulations. There certainly are regulations regarding fishing, at the recreational level and at the commercial level. And interestingly, there are ways of incorporating the power of the market and using private property rights even in commercial fishing. So one solution that has evolved is the use of shares of a sustainable catch. So basically, some agency, some fishing, and wildlife agency would determine what is the sustainable catch from a particular, region for a given year. And they say, all right, this is the sustainable catch. Then we'll divide that up into so many shares. And the shares are owned by commercial fishermen, and they can buy and sell them just like you could buy and sell tradable pollution permits. So if you take the sustainable, whatever is the determined sustainable catch for that year, and you divide it into a set number of shares, those shares could be, somehow initially issued to all the commercial fishermen, and then they can buy and sell them. If somebody goes out of business, they can sell their shares to others. Somebody's a startup, they have to buy, shares in order to get started. But then you need some level of policing, right, to ensure that people are only harvesting the quantity of fish they are, entitled to, right, that their share allows them to harvest. But with that, you don't have a massive rush to collect them all, to catch them all at once. You can catch them over time. You can do it, effectively and efficiently, and ultimately leave behind enough fish so that there is a sustainable population of fish there in the future as well. So just another example of how you might incorporate markets and property rights even in a problem, where there are externalities and problems with ownership. So in a nutshell, that's the tragedy of the commons. Follow up if